U.S. President Barack Obama recently announced the launch of a new partnership with Sub-Saharan Africa aimed at improving democracy, economic growth, security and trade in the region. In a recent interview with Membe, the Tanzanian Minister of Foreign Affairs, he discussed the increased interest of world powers in Africa and the challenge it poses to the continent's leaders.
This continent of Africa has become a victim of the entire outside world for two things: resources and a market. What you see now, Makori, is the indirect competition and the seeming war between the powers that are focusing their attention in the continent, trying to create their own economic spheres of influence, if you may. And so you have the China-Africa debate going on, where all of us are being called to discuss areas of cooperation. You have Turkey Africa, you have Iran Africa, you have EPA Africa, that is European Union Africa. Now you have AGOA Africa. Each of these big powers trying to influence countries in the continent so that freely we discuss economic partnerships, because without the resources that we accumulate in that continent, this world can collapse. But the opposite is not the case. We can stand. The continent can stand.
But that is the irony of it. If
Yes.
the continent has the resources, the continent has a resilient population, my assumption is that it has very intelligent leadership. Why do the African leaders, African officials, behave like they need to be told what to do? Why not take control of the continent with all the resources and determine the course of Africa's future? Why must you come to Washington to be told what to do in your country?
Thank you so much. This is the confusion that the world creates over Africa. You know, when the competition is so high and when the world is struggling for markets and resources, they can sometimes grip the leadership in the continent and confuse the leadership in the continent to the point where the Africans sometimes don't know where to go, whether you should go to the west, whether you should go to the east, and where would you benefit the most. And so it is a continent in crisis, a crisis of competition, where the big powers, unlike in 1884, where they simply came and divided Africa into 13 major powers.
Would you say it's a crisis of leadership more than any other crisis, whereby there is no leadership that is strong enough to stand up for the people of Africa, for the resources of Africa?
I know where you're going. It's not so much of a crisis of leadership, it's a crisis of common leadership, collective leadership. Because for that continent to emancipate itself from this type of competition, you need collective leadership at the continental level. In the absence of a collective leadership, you cannot own that continent. You cannot really put that continent in your own domain. If we are not collectively engaged in taking control of the resources together, collectively, penetration of Africa will be a disaster, because that continent is easily penetratable if you are not collectively engaged. So you may have individual powerful and strong leaders in the continent, but we need a collective leadership to own the resources.
So what prevents the leadership from forging that collectivity, to a collective nature of leadership, so that the continent can have one voice, the continent can have a common approach to issues, whether they're democracy related issues or even economic development related issues?
Well, we need a very strong AU, the African Union. We need very strong regional economic groupings. But if I can just comment, you know, we didn't fare well in the past 2-3 years, where you witnessed the big powers penetrating the continent to the extent of going to one country, killing a leader in broad daylight, and then you call that a spring, a certain spring. You can call it Arab Spring or so what. The continent was there just watching. That is a disgrace to the continent. You are making these powers feel that they can easily penetrate the continent for resources, market, and even installing leadership. And to me, that is a disgrace. We needed a very strong AU African Union that can say no when there is this type of penetration, that can determine its own future, that can have its roadmap on how to enhance this intra-African trade. And correctly, as you are saying, you didn't need to come to Washington to be told the ABC on how to enhance intra-African trade. We know the benefits of intra-African trade. We know the benefits of transportation. We know what is meant by hard infrastructure and soft infrastructure. You don't need lectures for this, but we need a very strong organization of the African unity and a very strong regional groupings.
Well, that was Bernard Membe, Tanzania's Minister of Foreign Affairs, speaking with us on In Focus.